Right, we're here today with, well, so far, one of the Northern Powerhouse Metro mayors, Andy Burnham. We're just waiting for Steve Rotheram to join us here in the downtown den. Andy and Steve have been on a press conference, which is slightly overrun, talking about the Build Back Better initiative. And before we get into that, Andy, because I'm conscious that Steve, I'm sure, will want to make some comments around the conference that's happened this afternoon. Let's just focus for a moment on what's been happening with I suppose, the response from Greater Manchester. We had Joanne Roney with us yesterday, and I have to say, Andy, looking at from the outside, you know, Greater Manchester has responded superbly well, very collaborative in its approach, and as you would expect, I suppose, from the city and the city region. Great partnerships that have been developed through the public-private sector, and you've seen some great initiatives happening, haven't you?
Yeah, that's right, Frank. You know, I'm very lucky to have inherited a place that has this kind of partnership culture. You know, the strength of those relationships is real. I felt it in May 2017 when tragedy struck, but you feel it again in moments like this. You know, there's a real culture of collaboration and partnership in Greater Manchester. I think it helps, you know, that we have a degree of control over health. So our health service is very closer to our councils and police and other public services. So that helps us. But yeah, I mean, just to pluck out a few highlights, Frank, we put in place a procurement drive for PPE on our own initiative early on, and that certainly paid dividends and is doing for us. We ran a mutual aid system so that, you know, organisations were sharing PPE across the system. Again, that shows you the trust that's there. Homelessness, a massive effort amongst councils, voluntary sector, and others to get people inside. So over 1,300 people have been supported in hotel accommodation, and yeah, just really, you know, but it'd be the same in many ways in the Liverpool City region. But you know, GM is kind of used to working in this way now, and the more we get into devolution, the stronger this culture gets. I've been chairing a weekly sort of GM Cobra, I suppose you could call it, and that has been helping sort of create that clarity, if you like, into the system. So, been you know, it's obviously a tough time, Frank, and you know, will remain so. But yeah, very proud of the way people have responded.
Welcome, Steve. Good to see you. We'll bring you into the conversation in a moment. Just before I leave that particular subject of collaboration and, you know, some great private sector, public sector initiatives, as I say. One standout for me, Andy, has been the work that Sasha Lord has done with United We Stream, and you know, a bit of a revival in terms of memories from the Hacienda. I had to laugh at your comment when you said you got kicked off, didn't you, at one point, and said this is just like being back in the real thing when I couldn't get in. But I mean, it's raised over £250,000 already, that particular initiative, hasn't it? It's just such a fantastic idea, and it's really caught people's imaginations.
It really has, Frank. You know, Sasha's an incredible talent, really, in terms of the way, and you know, he just gets on with things. It's fantastic to have somebody like him working with us. But you know, that money is going back into supporting the nighttime economy, and you know, that's what I asked him to do when he took on this role. So my goodness, hasn't he done it in this this moment? And it's about a window on Greater Manchester to the world, isn't it? You know, everyone can from around the world can look in and kind of get a taste of Greater Manchester talent, creativity. It was something we took from Berlin, actually. So, you know, we can't claim credit for inventing it, but we were quick in partnering with Berlin. And it was a very club-oriented thing. And obviously our services kept that. But we've had bands on there, like the Slow Readers Club. We've had Maxine Peake on, you know, all kinds of different things have been on. And yeah, it's gonna, you know, it's something we think we're gonna carry on building. There's even a rumour, although it's only a rumour at this stage, that there might be a Manchester versus Liverpool DJ set by the mayors, which we're in talks anyway. Let's put it that way. We're in talks with our agents about it. Steve is that's one Manchester Liverpool contest. I'm not sure he's relishing because he's only got one band to play into it, and he's worried, he's panicking. But anyway, it might come off. So United we stream. Keep you never know what might turn up on there.
Well, that's a challenge that I'm sure Steve will be happy to get involved in at some stage in the future. But Steve, thanks for joining us. I know that you've had this Build Back Better press conference today, and that's overran. We've just been talking about Greater Manchester's reaction to the crisis and that collaborative approach that as we've always known Greater Manchester for, but of course Liverpool and the City region likewise always seem to rally in times of difficulties and challenge. And similarly, Steve, you'll have some great stories and great examples of how those partnerships have come to the fore and stood up and been counted in recent weeks.
Yeah, Frank, hopefully I'm now live. Can I just say, by the way, I know I need my hair cutting and Andy needs his cutting, but that's the worst barnet I've seen in probably the last 6 or 7 weeks. So you get the prize, Frank.
I thought I'd tidied myself up for you.
How will you? My God.
I think that's all right, Andy. No. You can always expect the bloody Reds to take you into the
right. Frank, don't listen to him. He appeared on the BBC 6 o'clock news in his tracky bottoms a couple of weeks ago. So don't take any fashion advice off him.
You know what? I'm not letting that one go because they said to me, right, it's from the waist up. We'll film you from the waist up, just like now. I mean, I don't know what you've got on below the waist, Frank. You could.
I don't want to know what you've got on.
It scares the life out of me. But yet then he took a long shot and I've got a pair of, man, they wear Hugo Boss, you know what I mean? I am a Scouser, you know, so. Yeah, look, what are we doing? The Build Back Better is supposed to be about a different way of doing things. And that's because we've been trying for 3 years now to do things differently in the Liverpool City region because we haven't got that history of AGMA, of the 10 local authorities in Greater Manchester trying to work together for a decade or more. Well, several decades, wasn't it, really? We haven't got that. And so we've started at a different place in this. But those relationships are really important to what we want to do together collectively to try and take things forward. And you'll see through the recovery phase how even those embryonic relationships will be pivotal to the success of what we do to try and mitigate the worst excesses and certainly some of the aftershocks of a post-COVID world. And we're doing that now. The other day, the Prime Minister said, that he's going to support us in leading the recovery, which is good because we've got one point of contact now. Will be the areas where they've got metro mayors that will be leading those recovery phases, and there will be more than one, of course. And he said, I'm just reading off my notes actually, and he said that we had his unflinching support. So if that's the case, what's it going to look like? What do we need to do? Who do we need to engage in this? Where do we need to go? What would we like to see Build Back Better becoming? And I missed the first bit, thankfully, because Andy was speaking. So he might well have touched on some of the things that we've just discussed in the press conference, but that it started to catch fire. I don't know whether the people watching this, Frank, will be aware of just how much it's caught the public's imagination, this Build Back Better, because you saw the survey, didn't you, that said that only 9% of people want to go back to what it was before. And I think even that's a fairly high percentage, to tell you the truth. I don't think it's that many. I think most people don't want to return to the bad old days. And some of those bad old days were about decisions taken by central governments with a one-size-fits-all approach that didn't do us any favours in the Northwest. And I suppose that's one of the reasons, and we've spoken to you before, me and Andy, about why we put ourselves forward for these positions as Metro Mayors. Andy had a safe seat in Lee, unfortunately no longer, but it was under Andy Burnham. I had the safest seat in the country, and we could have been parliamentarians and going through what happens down there probably until our retirement days. And what we decided to do is to take this opportunity really to start to shape the destinies of the places that we both now lead. And it is about what we do in our individual areas, but the scale and synergies of Andy and myself being able to work across that geography to put aside some of those tribal rivalries, that started to pay dividends. And, you know, governments is starting to listen to us. We had the conversation with the Prime Minister on Friday, and you know, as people will know, they are normally a honest and frank exchange of views. Actually, him being a former mayor of London sort of got it. He did understand where we were coming from, and we're saying, if you really want to accelerate recovery, then there are 9 areas with metro mayors and devolution agreements and assurance frameworks that between them have more than 50% of GDP, and that should be a starting point. So, yeah, Frank, relationships internally, very important, but also externally with government and other stakeholders.
Can I just pick the point up that Steve's made there about the government, Andy, and its performance? And listen, I know now is not the time to get into the party politics of this. But, you know, whether it's right or wrong, I've been fairly critical of the government's approach to the crisis on the health and care side of things. I think on the economic side, I have to give credit to Rishi Sunak. I think that he's stepped up and he's provided some incredibly ambitious packages and packages of financial support that we wouldn't have dreamt of 3 or 4 months ago. But, you know, for me, Andy, we were slow to get into the lockdown. In Liverpool, we saw over 3,000 Madrid supporters arriving at Liverpool Airport and then going on to Anfield. We saw the Cheltenham Race Festival go ahead. And now we've seen cases where PPE hasn't been provided and our care and health staff have been put at risk. So, you know, it's difficult, I think, although we are in crisis. If we don't identify these issues now, these things can be quickly forgotten, mate. You know, 3 or 4 months in advance of this, and we're all talking about economic recovery, and what's just gone can quickly be forgotten, as I say, brushed under the table. And that's why I think Bring Back Better is such an important campaign, because actually, if we are to learn the lessons of failure, and we don't have to cast blame on politicians and political leaders and governments, what we do have to do, though, I would argue, is, as I say, learn those lessons and make sure that we start to value those things that we've all started to value in recent weeks over a sustainable longer term period.
Yeah, no, I agree with your analysis, Frank. I think arguably better on the economy side than on the health side. Although Steve just reminded everybody at the press briefing that the message was whatever it takes, which feels less and less what is happening. We saw last week figures that showed the virus is hitting the poorest communities hardest. And that's true of a lot of Steve's area and mine. But those same deprived communities lost a lot of funding last week because the government removed a deprivation weighting from the funding. So, you know, you kind of look at things like that and you think, hang on a minute, you know, because to be honest, we've not been point scoring through this. We've been trying to preserve a degree of national unity, but decisions like that really do not help us at all, really, particularly when they've got all these commitments to levelling up as a government. You know, you're taking money off Lee, Steve mentioned it, you know, well, why? You know, that, on what basis are they doing that? So, and I think Rishi has been very good, but there's been gaps in his provision, isn't there? Sort of gaps that, because they're so small in some ways, seem even more unfair on the people who are caught in those little gaps. So people who started new jobs in March, you know, the new starter issue and no access to the furlough scheme. I think it's still not quite right for people who became self-employed in the last year. There's the issue of company directors. I think somebody's just emailed about that. You know, again, they've been left without any support. And those, given that the amount of money needed to correct those little things is very, very small. I just wonder why they haven't done that. And you know, I will keep appealing on the Chancellor to correct those things, because he seems decent, you know, and he's done a lot of good things. But why leave those other things unsorted? On the health side, well, I dealt with swine flu, as people may have heard me say, a decade ago, and I don't think there can be a perfect response to a pandemic when it in the middle of the health crisis side of it. And, you know, I made mistakes. Any government will make mistakes in this situation. The issue is, you know, how quickly do you respond to those mistakes, and do you also work with others to sort of, you know, build out the national response? I think they've been too top down. I think Steve would probably agree with me. You know, the PPE situation, we did do more, and we kind of almost worked around what the government was doing. I'll give you another example. The NHS volunteers scheme, it kind of made this big thing. Let's get NHS volunteers. And 750,000 people land on a list that doesn't do anything, because then they took those volunteers away from local communities who could have probably used them more in terms of the community hubs we've got. So there are things they need to take on board. We hear they're about to sign a national contract on contact tracing, which again would be a mistake. I think, you know, they should lean on us more to do that, because we've got the experts that know how to do it in our areas. And on testing, you know, they just were putting capacity in willy-nilly as they were chasing that target, that 100,000 target. And again, the local input was minimal. So there are definitely lessons, but I think this isn't the time for it. I've tried to be as supportive as I can. We all need the government to succeed to get the country through this. But, you know, more engagement, I think. We had a call with the Prime Minister, it was welcome, but I think we should have had more regular input. You know, I think it's right that Sadiq Khan is on COBRA, but why isn't a representative of the English regions on COBRA alongside him? You know, it felt a bit like the government was talking a lot about levelling up, and the minute the crisis hit, it went back to its default London-centric mentality. And you know, I'm afraid that mentality is still buried quite deep within the British civil service.
And you mentioned just on the devolution point, Andy, and I think, you know, again, something that we've been arguing for is for more responsibility, more resources to be devolved. And of course, you did reference in your opening remarks that Greater Manchester, unlike other devolved areas, has responsibility for health and social care. How much of a benefit has that been to be able to, you know, direct those resources in a way that locally has fitted Greater Manchester?
Well, it has been a real benefit, certainly through this situation where we, as I say, have much closer working. I think we do increasingly function as one system. It's not perfect, but it's certainly getting there all the while. You know, it's something that kind of gets stronger the longer that we have this arrangement. But even before this crisis, Frank, you know, we had our health service funding homeless shelters. So recognizing that health is built in homes and in communities. It's not built in hospitals, is it? You know, hospitals deal with the consequences of not having good, healthy environments in communities. So I think you begin to see some change through our system. We've made a real innovation in the midst of this crisis that I'm very proud of. And essentially, without going into too much of the jargon, it's the equivalent is it's a black alert system for our care homes. So hospitals currently have an alert system, you know, that escalates through different levels, and you know, if they get to black alert and they don't receive new patients, we've now agreed an alert system for our care homes, so they'll function as a system rather than a series of quite fragmented institutions, and that's happened in the middle of the crisis. So you know, I think that shows you that health devolution is innovating, it's changing things for the better, and we would want to, you know, hold on to it very, very strongly. I hope, Frank, coming out of this, and I've just said this to the briefing, that you know, in the way that the country on VE Day resolved to vote for a radical change in healthcare provision, which it did, I think coming out of this, we all need to resolve to call for a radical change in care provision. And I've always argued that these two systems should be one, health and care. And I think our experience shows that you can increasingly bring them together closer as one. So, you know, I think the Greater Manchester experiment is a route towards a fully integrated national health and care system. And we'll certainly be making the argument for that. The experience of people in care homes compared to the experience of people in hospitals during this crisis has been markedly different. And what's the justification for that? We need a system that can support people with dementia as well as it treats cancer and other conditions. And I just hope that is one of the big things that comes out of this crisis. And Greater Manchester is really well placed to be a sort of pilot area for a truly integrated, fully integrated health and care system.
I'm sure, Steve, that that's something that would be on your list of ambitions in the future, to take health and social care under the remit of the combined authority and yourself in Liverpool City region as well. But of course, what you do have is power over transport strategy. And of course, you've been having to direct Merseyrail in a different way. And I know conversations are ongoing about when we do coming back to work, how they're going to operate as a service. We know it's a fantastic service. Liverpool and the wider city region, very lucky to have it. And also you made the call to scrap charges on the Mersey Tunnel. Now, again, that was very welcome in times of economic challenge, but it's costing a few bob. So when Andy references the fact that we've taken a bit of a hit, both in Manchester and Liverpool, in terms of budgets, I'm guessing that one of the conversations that you will be having with the Prime Minister, if you haven't already, is how we can start to replenish some of those budgetary hits that you've taken already.
Yes, Frank. I think the first thing is that we talk about health and social care and devolved to Greater Manchester. Andy and I are one on this. We believe in the N in the NHS, but we believe that by having input locally, you can improve the national health service to respond better, to deliver the things in the individual areas that are necessary. So it's not about breaking up the NHS. You can imagine that people from our political party sometimes are very nervous about when we speak about the NHS. We're as protective as anybody else, and certainly, you've got Andy as a former Secretary of State for Health who's seen the inner workings of this, and there's no way that we're talking about its fragmentation or breakup. Just on public transport first, Frank, if that's all right, and then I'd love to touch on some of the things about preparedness, and we don't want to repeat those mistakes for what comes out of this transition phase under lockdown. But we had this conversation with Boris Johnson on Friday, and one of the bits that I had to feed back to him and request was public transport. And so I've split it into 5 different groups on public transport, and I'll try and whiz through these. So we're going to need some extended support way after lockdown. That's everybody's in agreement, all Metro mayors, party political or not. And some of the reason is because we're not going to go back to a public transport system like we had before all this started. And one of the things where Andy's talking about local government finances, one of the things that will affect the very fact that our local authorities were told whatever it takes, and they were promised that they would get tranches of money, yes, with the social deprivation methodology, and then the second bit was per capita, which in our area is denied them £137 million that they were promised if it had been in a different methodology. But all of that conspires really because the ability for our local authorities to provide myself and Andy with more levy for public transport has been destroyed because their base has been detrimentally impacted by government policy. So that's the first thing on that. On social distancing, which again we've asked about, if we try and keep people 2 meters apart on public transport, anyone can work this out. We're going to be on at least a quarter or less per bus and per train than previously we had, and yet our operational costs are going to be the same. But if we have to put more services on, they're going to exponentially rise, by, if we have to put, say there was 50% capacity on 2 buses, but we need to socially distance further, we'll have to put 2 buses on for the same cohort, but we'll be getting less money on each bus. So, I did spell this out to Johnson. Again, as a former mayor of London, he understands public transport, but he was actually quite receptive to some of this. The other thing is about restoring confidence in public transport. We're going to see modal shift. People now are going to say, do you know the best way I can socially distance? Getting in my own car. Yeah. That is not what we want. Think about the environmental consequences to that. And we've all declared because of climate emergencies, and we're going to go back to that. No, thank you very much. I think we're enjoying the roads that are less congested, and as a result, the cleaner air that we're able to breathe. And that's something that if we build back better, we want to maintain that. So what do we have to do about instilling confidence that public transport is safe? We're cleaning our public transport systems more regularly. There's a cost to that. And of course, if we are going to move towards encouraging people onto public transport, should we be saying that people should cover their face? For me and Sadiq, 3 weeks ago, nearly 4 weeks ago, we said that face coverings should be an integral part of the transition on public transport towards the new norm. And I'm still convinced of it. I think Andy is supporting face coverings, whether it's face masks, whether it's mandatory, what type of face masks does that mean? All of that, that's the detail. But we should have been into the detail now, because we should have had a steer nationally, and we didn't. Boris Johnson going through COVID himself and then saying, I think we should talk about face coverings, it might be a good idea now, is not government policy. And there's a differential there that we need to somehow square. And then the last bit, Frank, is about commercial transport and public transport. The model that we've got now of it being franchised and broken up, and our areas deregulated, and all of that, for me, the model is now broken. And I explained to him that it's not viable for us, myself and Andy and other public transport authorities, to be picking up the tab for those services and those extended and additional operational costs, whilst we have some companies who will cherry pick the profitable routes, and we'll have to subsidise the rest of the network. That just cannot continue. So something needs to happen, and we need government to work with us on that one. But yeah, massive issue for us, public transport. Our trains at the moment running on about 16%. Our buses even less than that. But that will build up, and we have lost £1.2 million per week already. And the idea behind the tunnels was to ensure that our essential workers were recognised for the role that they were playing. But I guess what? The number of people who are using the tunnels has grown and grown and grown each week, as we can see the traffic outside our own windows grow and grow. It's not essential traffic. It will have to come to an end, and we'll have to put plans in place so that we can reintroduce a tolling regime. And I know that that's going to cause a bit of a kickback and all that. Why do we need tunnel fees? Well, if somebody can tell me where that magic money tree is, I'll go and plug the budget deficit that we've already accrued, and that will continue every single week until government help us out.
Thanks, Stephen. Let's turn to the recovery plan then, Andy. And as Steve's indicated there, we've not had an awful lot of detail. I'm not sure whether the Prime Minister shared any additional thoughts with you guys last week, and I certainly wouldn't expect you to breach any confidences. But of course, what Greater Manchester and Liverpool City region will be doing is working up some very specific regionalised, localised plans for recovery. And there's certain sectors that you will be conscious will be coming back into work before others, and then there'll be other parts of the economy that will require more TLC going forward. I'm thinking particularly, Andy, the burgeoning hospitality and cultural sector that you've got in your part of the world, and similarly in Liverpool as well. What are yourself, Eamon Boylan and co, thinking about in terms of recovery plans, what that might look like and how GM might be able to support its business community?
So it's a good question, Frank. I've put forward the notion of a safety-led or a standards-led release from lockdown. So it's frustrating that we still hear talk in the media of a region-by-region approach or a local approach, or indeed a sectoral approach. Both, I think, pose real problems because it could hold one part of the country back unfairly, depending on the mix of sectors, or obviously if it is a straight regional approach. And I think whatever we do, the whole of the country's got to move in lockstep together if we're not to exacerbate this sense of unfairness. So I'm pleased actually it's picked up some kind of currency in the last week. So the government, in many ways, I think, is getting close to it by putting out this advice that they did yesterday. You know, what does every sector need to do to adapt? You know, and that's how it should be, shouldn't it? You know, it's an invitation to business to innovate, so they can get back to a form of work, but then keep, for those who are going to struggle the most, and you mentioned hospitality, well, I think there needs to be a flexible furlough scheme there, doesn't there? So they need to have the ability to use furlough in maybe sometimes some part-time, but then on furlough for other parts of the week, or certainly going beyond June, because that will be a cliff edge that would, I think, send the hospitality sector to its destruction at the bottom of that cliff if they push them off it. So, you know, we've made that argument just now at the press briefing. So those are some of the immediate thoughts, Frank. You know, don't take arbitrary decisions about region by region or sector by sector. You know, take a judgment on, are they able to meet the safety requirements as to whether or not people can get back to work. And the phasing, I think, comes with the numbers of people you allow in each sector back to work. So Steve and I will both be thinking now about city centre, office-based organisations, where we're going to have to say to them, look, maybe start with 30% and then maybe go up to 40, 50. Because with the reduced capacity on public transport, you know, we're going to have to manage this, aren't we? But let's not see it as a negative. You know, if you can allow more home working, more flexible working, you can stagger the start and end time of the day, you know, that might improve people's lives at the same time. So that's what Build Back Better is about. You know, how can we change things, but change things to something that works better for people than they did before? Because I know that the traditional 9 to 5 working day in Greater Manchester never worked particularly well in terms of the levels of congestion we've all experienced, you know, in the early morning and in the evening peak. So that's what it means in the immediate term, Frank. More to the future, I'm saying, well, bring forward the things that you know we need to do as a society anyway. So the housing crisis, clearly should get on and address that now, not just building kind of the bog standard homes of the past, but modular homes, zero carbon homes, you know, bring on new industry through this, lay that digital infrastructure, clean up the air, you know, give grants to SMEs and self-employed people to change their vehicles to non-polluting vehicles. You know, that is a good way of helping them, but also capturing the benefit of this moment that we're living through. So that's where our thinking is, Frank, you know, making a kind of pitch to the government about accelerating what it was going to have to do anyway, so that we kickstart the economy. And let's be honest, we're going to have to be in the business of job creation, Steve and I. We're going to have to think really carefully about how do we create opportunities for young people who might otherwise be a lost generation through this, or those people who might, you know, end up on the scrap heap if we think of the 80s, whatever, you know, just this idea that redundancy is nothing you can do about it. Well, there are things you can do about it, particularly when you've got capable combined authorities who are ready to put in place schemes that can run right across a city region. So that's the way our thinking is developing on it, Frank. Build Back Better, though, is a sort of invitation to everybody to think about how, you know, it's not just a call on the government, it's not a political campaign, it's a, you know, it's a positive, collaborative, open invitation for all organisations to work with us to sort of think about how do we reshape things coming out of this in a way that works for business, but also works for wider society as well.
And Steve, before I go to our audience for a few questions, we've had some emailed in and some on the chat platform as well. Well, one on the chat platform, but we've had several that have directly emailed. Just picking up on what Andy was saying in terms of Greater Manchester's plans for recovery. I know, again, I've been involved in conversations at Liverpool City region level, and you've been keen to look ahead as to what opportunities may come out of these difficulties. But also I know that you've been thinking hard about how we can start to help some of those businesses that, as described earlier, have fallen through the gaps of the Chancellor's support mechanisms. Do you want to just give us an update on where Liverpool City Region's up to in terms of that recovery process?
Yeah, thanks, Frank. So we've got something called a recovery cell, but on the recovery cell, which is a statutory body through the LRF, the Local Resilience Forum, there's people like the British Red Cross on it and British Water and all sorts of people, because that's a body set up for what you determine to be an emergency. So, for instance, in our area, the explosion over in New Ferry, you would have something like that, and that would be set up. And I get that. But for a pandemic, we're going to need something completely different. And that's why recovery panels will need to have an economic focus, as well as the other things that we've spoken about, skills and transport and environment and all sorts of different things. And it appears that the government are now saying that they should be led by metro mayors. In fact, Boris Johnson, I've got what he said. He said, I'll certainly want you to be leading. That's what Johnson said on Friday. So he said we also had his unflinching support. For whatever it's worth, genuinely for what, I don't know what it's worth, because, sometimes he says things and it's not always the actuality of what then follows. So given that we've got this recovery panel process, the most important thing for us then is to get that bit right, because that will have an absolute impact on the type of recovery in our individual areas. And Andy's saying some of the things that we have, which are common between the two major areas. But our visitor economy, I'd say, certainly in the centre of Liverpool, is probably more important than it is in a greater Manchester context. I think if you look at the GVA and all that sort of stuff, from the comparison between the two, that's mega important too. So it'll form an integral part of the recovery. But it's going to be later on, isn't it? I mean, I don't think you're going to see bars and restaurants and clubs opening in the next few months. I think that'll come after other things have been unlocked. And so what are we looking at in the immediacy? That's important. What's the medium-term proposal? And then what's the long-term strategy for the areas? And again, just you can tell that we do speak, myself and Andy sometimes have exactly the same sort of thoughts. And it will be about, we can either sit back and just say, this stuff's happening and there's nothing we can do about it. And that's the old style, or we can build back better and try and say, well, what are the things that we can do to intervene and to potentially create some of those opportunities? And I did an exercise. We've mocked up some of the underspend. I've got to be careful with this. It's not underspent money. It's money that's in stasis because we allocated it to things that currently cannot take place because of the lockdown. So I just need to clarify that. It's not underspent money. But we're putting that into a pot straight away, and we've said we can use that for certain things. Well, we're doing that at scale as well, Frank. We're looking at what we said we'd do before COVID, but what we need to do post-COVID now. And that's the shift, really. And it's a big shift in mentality. And it'll mean that some of the things that we would like to have done and some of the projects that we would like to have supported, potentially we're not going to be able to do that, because one thing is we need to secure what we've got now. And I've said the best way in which we can secure the recovery is to ensure that we do as little damage to the economy now as it's possible to do. So in other words, government needs to work with us so that we can keep things going, because we want an economy to call an economy at the end of this. But then, do we have to spend the money that the way that we previously thought we were going to spend it, and possibly not. But the third factor in this, which is the most essential, is that government, one, it needs to stop battering our local authorities, because that does inhibit the ability of anybody to do some of the things that it needs to do. And the social deprivation factor needs to be put back into the methodology. But after that, where can the government get the biggest bang for its buck? That's what it needs to start looking at. Not leaving other areas behind, but where can it get the recovery started? Because the recovery helps everybody. And it seems to me like with the complementarity of Manchester Airport and Liverpool being a port city, with us, having both digital aspirations, with us having stuff around the accelerated and advanced manufacturing industries, stuff around life sciences, things that we will need in the future. We've already got lots of those pieces of the jigsaw now. Let's build on that and let's see whether we can start to get some of that growth, because at the end of the day, as long as it's inclusive growth, and that's what we both believe in, but as long as we get some of that inclusive growth, and I believe in community wealth building alongside that, then we can start to address some of the aftershocks that inevitably are going to come.
Okay. Thanks, guys. Let me just take you through a few questions. We've had several around the issue of the self-employed, and I know you did touch on this earlier, Andy, but I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about those representations that you have made to the Chancellor and to the government, because both Liverpool and Manchester, actually, lots and lots of self-employed people. Steve, you yourself were self-employed, so it is an issue, it is a concern, and we've even on the chat here now, we've got somebody saying self-employed and directors are really struggling because the signposting isn't particularly great, and even signposting doesn't really replace action that they feel is required. So Andy, I just wonder whether you've had any progress with those conversations that you've been having.
We got a little bit of progress, Frank, last week. We had made a very big case to the Treasury around the grant scheme administered by local authorities being limited to those with a business rates registration. And we were saying that was unfair on people who rent, but whose business rates are part of their rent, or who work in shared workspaces. Often they are self-employed people. So what came through late last week was, I don't know if people have noticed this yet, but there's been a decision that there can be more flexibility now in in opening up that scheme, that small grant scheme, to a much wider range of organisations, and I think that is progress. And I'm pleased that the government have listened to us on that. So we're going to discuss that at our Greater Manchester COVID Emergency Committee tomorrow. And I think what people will see is, I think we can set our own principles for how we're going to do it. And I think people will see more about that soon. So that's something. I know the company director's point. I think Jane is raising it on the chat. It's frustration, isn't it? Because of this idea that company directors are all very well paid and well off, and obviously that's not the reality. Often they're very stretched in terms of putting their own savings into their businesses, and again to sort of limit them in terms of the access to support, I don't think is fair. The issues that I mentioned on, we got some movement on the new starter issue because they moved the date to the 19th of March, but again I don't think that's helped a lot of people. So we've got to keep pressing on those things, because I don't think, we're going to, anytime soon, as Steve was saying, see a full return to the economy. And, what the noise, I spoke to a Treasury Minister yesterday, the noise we're getting back now, though, is that they've pretty much done what they're going to do, I'm afraid to say it. I'm sorry if that disappoints some people on the call, but that is the message I'm getting back from the government. So what I would say is, the campaigns that are running in these kind of areas, I think it's called Forgotten Limited, the directors campaign, and the new starter furlough campaign. I think, we need to sort of maybe redouble our efforts, I think, really, because just leaving them out in the cold doesn't seem right at all to me. So we will keep pressing, I can assure people of that. But I don't think I've got enough progress to report to satisfy people on those points yet.
Steve, you may want to pick up on that, but an additional question as well. This has come from Paul Alley at Festive Group, who Liverpool-based company but operate across the UK. Paul's business, as the title may give away, focuses on Christmas, and I'm sure we're all looking forward to that in for more ways than one. But equally, Paul has been quite innovative in that he's turned his attention, because of the materials that he has access to from his Spanish supply chain, to PPE. So again, I know that you've been involved in some conversations at government level, and Paul's just asking any clarity, or likely to be any further clarity, on what are going to be required to have when we do start that return to work, because obviously that can help him and other people in that sort of industry sector to begin to get those materials ready.
I think you and Mr. Burnham, all your Christmases would come at once if they did curtail the league and not award the Premier title to somebody, Frank. So I have got Christmas on my mind very much. Do you know what, genuinely, on the PPE stuff, we need to clarify what we're talking about with PPE, because people just use it as a terminology, PPE, and it's not a homogenous thing. For me, on a building site, PPE was very, very different than it was for somebody in catering who's a chef or whatever, or different in a hospital. And so when we're talking about face coverings, the reason was to try and get away from people thinking that they needed surgical or medical or some sort of scientific face covering. It's not. And PPE is really important, because not just to the NHS, because in different sectors we can't unlock the economy unless we have the correct PPE, and that's what it is, the correct or appropriate PPE. And there's loads of different standards and specifications of PPE for different things. So what we're trying to do is get the government to tell us what they want, because if they say face coverings, then we can get some sort of more simplistic masks that will not put a drain on the stocks of the NHS. So we don't want people competing against our frontline services. And that's why I think it's important that we talk about what is the most appropriate type of PPE. And the idea behind face masks is that I protect you and you protect me. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm not going to get it because I've got a face mask on, but it reduces it. And some of the papers, I was talking to Mandy about this, some of the papers that I've been reading in the New Medical Journal, in Lancet and stuff, there's some evidence that it can reduce your chances by 36 times. So you'd have, a 1 in 36 chance of getting something if you wore this. If everybody wore this, And then there's, what happens if somebody doesn't have it and some spittle lands on it and that has got coronavirus within it? Well, if you didn't have the face mask on, it'd go in your mouth anyway. So there's loads of sort of misinformation. That's why we need, for once, the government to provide clarification. And what it does, it comes out with statements and then just leaves it hanging, and we have to fill all the gaps. And, I want to see how we can work with people who are, involved in international trade or exports, what it is that we can do to help them export their stuff, but also what we need to import stuff ourselves. Loads of things, Frank, but it only comes from clarification from central government. And I know Jane, I'm genuinely heartbroken, because the things that I know that she's been signposted to, she seems to be one of those people who are falling through the gaps. And that's exactly, if you remember, what I said would happen. Government come up with these grandiose telephone figure type announcements, 330 billion. I don't even know how many zeros there are, but it's not helping some of the people that we need it to help. And that's why we need to have the flexibilities in funding to ensure that there are gains still going on after this to protect the economy, so there's something to go back to. And there's lots and lots of examples of people where they've not just fallen through the gaps, but the safety net of a civilized society and economy hasn't helped them. We can do that, but we need the government to provide us with the opportunities to help them out of the situation that sometimes that they create.
I'm going to try and just squeeze 2 questions in at once here, chaps, because I know that you're both pressed for time. Kevin Johnson from Urban Comms asks, given your recent discussions with the PM, are you confident that the levelling up agenda will be a priority for them as we emerge from the crisis? And linked to that slightly, and again, I know both of you will wish to respond to this. Sean Keys from Sutcliffe's is saying, it basically, in a nutshell, I'll edit the question somewhat. He doesn't want to see a London-led response to the crisis, and I think we would all know where he was coming from with that. You know, Liverpool, Manchester, other parts of the country doesn't want to be seen to be dancing to the London tune, because London is a very different place to Manchester, Liverpool and elsewhere. So again, back to you, Andy, both in terms of that levelling up question and also, you know, are you a bit concerned that London may take the lead on this recovery project and therefore the regions may get left behind?
Well, it's frustrating, Frank, that London is in the room and we're not. So we had the call on Friday, but that was a one-off call, whereas Sadiq is in there every single week or even day. So yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the government's got to decide whether it really means this thing about levelling up. So let's take the Prime Minister at his word, and I do take him at his word. You know, he couldn't have been clearer that it was, you know, his agenda at the heart of his government, and he said that on Friday. But then you get decisions that, you know, we've all alluded to this afternoon that kind of then don't really bear that out. But I think we're hitting the crunch here, aren't we? You know, as we get into this into this thing. The key is levelling up so far has only been spoken about in terms of infrastructure. Now, don't get me wrong, infrastructure is really critically important. But it's got to be about more than that, because this could be a moment where we're looking at a lost generation of young people. The disruption in young people's lives, particularly those who are at university or taking A-levels, massive, absolutely massive. And it could really derail them and, you know, leave them in a really difficult place. You know, that the British way of the past won't work for those young people, i.e., oh, well, they're going to have to just find their own way back. I do think we're going to have a more interventionist approach here. Levelling up has got to be about people as well as infrastructure. And it's got to be about bringing forward the future that we've all talked about, you know, climate change and everything it entails. Well, this is the moment to get on and to do something about that. So I think the fairest way to describe it, Frank, is the jury's out. You know, the government's going to have to put its cards on the table soon as to how we're going to approach this thing called recovery that lies ahead of us. And I think the way in which it lays down the kind of foundations for how it's going to go about that will pretty much tell you whether or not levelling up is a real thing, or whether it's a bit like the Northern Powerhouse, you know, just kind of a bit of a slogan, but not much substance. I think I'm just saying, benefit of the doubt. I hope the Prime Minister means what he says, but I think we're probably about to find out in very real terms. And you know, if they continue with a London representation on any National Recovery Committee, but none for Steve, myself, and others, then I think that will tell you all you need to know.
Okay. And Steve, just final word to you in terms of the questions from the audience, and particularly pick up on that point of a London-led recovery rather than taking account of the regions. And again, let me just make the point, because we have some people watching today from our Birmingham membership, and Andy Street has been joining you in your calls to have that regional representation. Thus far, it's not happened, but just as I say, Steve, let me get your reaction to that question about London-led recovery over regions.
There was a similar sort of question, you know, Frank, on the press conference, and we have to be careful here that what we're not arguing is that London and its economy need to falter and there needs to be a huge detriment to London for us to gain from it. I don't think that's true. I think that they can be symbiotic. We can win whilst London wins as well. But what we need is a fair crack at the whip, don't we? We need for us to be treated similarly to London. And London is 8.5 million-ish. The North, and I know you've got people from the Midlands and they'll argue their own case at a later date, but the North, 16 million people in the North. And we've heard for years, since Osborne first muted it, about the Northern Powerhouse and all this sort of stuff. And it was meant to be a balance against an overheating, London-centric national economy. That's what it was supposed to be. And demonstrably has not worked, because we haven't seen that rebalancing of the UK economy in those 6 years, 7 years, whatever it might be. And so how do we genuinely get there? Again, Andy said, they talk about levelling up. It's not. It's dragging back and holding down. That's what we've got at the moment. Release us. Release the latent potential in Greater Manchester and in Liverpool City region. We're already trying to work together. Between us, I think there's about 5 million people. That means that population-wise, we're bigger than Scotland. I know we're not a nation, but I'm talking about just Greater Manchester, Liverpool. And if you think about our GDP and GVA, I bet you we can compete against Scotland. Now, I'd quite like to see Andy become the new Nicola Sturgeon. I think he'd be brilliant at that sort of thing. But in regard to representing our views and needs and our asks to central government, we do need somebody down there. We do need somebody who's like Sadiq, who's got, and Nicola Sturgeon, who's got that in straight away to government. Cobra, when it meets, it considers the nations, quite rightly so, and considers London. And so I'm not having a go at Sadiq. I think Sadiq's doing a brilliant job for London and Londoners. We want the ability to do a great job for the North and Northerners, specifically for the Liverpool City region and Greater Manchester populations. But also we can speak with some authority about what would be best in the north of England and the northwest more specifically. So I don't think it's about that London need to come down a level. I think it's that we need to raise our game a level that we can start to compete with them.
Steve,
Nicola.
If I can just thank you, Frankie. I should have known that one was coming. Steve, this is breaking confidence a little, but it was such a good phrase that I'll just repeat it here, because it was one the Prime Minister used on Friday. Now, Steve, correct me if I've got this wrong, but when we were making these points, he said, well, yeah, I know that you've got a point. And he says, and to be fair, the Treasury have always regarded this country as a global, megalopolis, whatever it is, a metropolis with some interesting countryside around it. I mean, he didn't use that phrase. Yeah. I know that's the way the Treasury have always viewed this country, and I was like, we were like, well, finally. But yeah, sorry, just to without extending the point too far, we come from a very different perspective, as you know, and we've got many differences with him, but he does see it from our perspective. He's been in our shoes. He sees it from that ground level, looking back up, if you like, as opposed to just having lived in Whitehall and looking down. And it makes a big difference, Frank. It does make a big difference. And you've got to hang on to that in this moment to say, well, actually, he probably is going to back mayors, I think, and back CAs, because he remembers the frustration of this working with that Whitehall machine when he was in our position. So let's give him a chance, and let's see if we can rebalance the country coming out of this.
And if that's what you're talking about, Frank, if you're talking about the London thing as in Westminster, then yeah, I'm bought into that. I thought you meant London as the metropolis as a city and as an economy. That's a different argument. But if you're talking about Whitehall and Westminster, I've long been a critic. You know how vocal I've been about some of the things that I witnessed and some of the things that I heard when I was a parliamentarian that are just not acceptable. But that is the perception of certain people and certain institutions down there, and we need to disavow them of their prejudices. And the best way we can do that is through devolution. Give us the powers ourselves, and we don't need to rely on the likes of that lot down there. He couldn't point to Salford or to Sefton on a map. And so why would you think that they've got the best interests of those areas at heart? They obviously haven't. They've failed us for decades. The best way is for us to do it ourselves, and we can. Me and Nicola are set up, mate.
Right, listen, chaps, it's as always been entertaining and informative in equal measure. We've run out of time. I know Andy's going on another call. I know, Steve, you'll be going to get your hair cut. So can't even get the ball out, which I'd have loved to have done for 5 minutes. One final point I'll make, and I did make this statement very publicly, but I thought that, I welcome Keir Starmer's election as leader of the Labour Party. I won't ask either of you guys to comment now. We've, as I say, run out of time. But I think a signal from the party actually would be to give a regional voice as well onto the shadow cabinet and to the national executive if it doesn't already. And I've nominated Nicola as well, Steve. So hopefully somebody will listen soon, because I think Andy would be a tremendous voice for the whole of the Northern Powerhouse. So let's see if that one grows legs and carries forward, makes some progress. Chaps, great to see you today. Hope you stay well, and hope to see you at a live event very soon as well.
Cheers. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Andy. See you, Steve. Thanks, guys.
Bye now. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.